Hey, everybody, welcome to Fulfilled. I'm your host, Rebecca Sheehan. I am so excited about today's conversation. I'm joined by Aaron Dranoff, host of the Torah Guide podcast and website, where he helps people understand the Hebrew Bible and how it points to Jesus. I've been wanting to talk with Aaron personally because questions about Torah, Jewish identity, and following Jesus come up a lot for me, as you may already know if you're familiar with my story and background. Aaron is a Messianic Jew, meaning he believes Jesus is the Messiah while remaining rooted in Jewish identity and scripture. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about it. Like you said, there's not a whole lot of us. It's kind of a small community, so it's always exciting to get to talk about it with another Jewish believer.
Love it. So, for listeners who may not know you yet, what's your background and how did you come to faith in Jesus as a Messianic Jew?
Yeah, so my family is Jewish, and was always very important growing up that my family take hold of that identity. My parents wanted us to know that we were Jewish. And even though that identity was important to us, the religion aspect of it was just not a big deal at all. It was one of the many Jewish people, I'm sure you can relate or you know people who can relate, who the Jewish ethnicity was super important and super relevant, but we're not going to synagogue. We'll do Passover, we'll do Hanukkah, and that's all we really want to partake in.
100%. Don't you feel like it's almost a badge of honor for some Jews to say, "Oh, I'm not religious"? And it's like more about the food.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, like if you have pride in your identity, but you don't want all of the requirements that come along with it, totally. Also, this was not always the case. If you look back at history, it's so new that most Jewish people are not observant, not religious.
I think that's so interesting because within Judaism, assimilation into other cultures and religions is a big problem. And it probably is due in part to the fact that there's not that much like religious identity among a lot of Jews, and they want to understand why they're here, like all these existential questions that people have that cultural Jews raised in that community, they're just not getting answers to, and so they search elsewhere.
I definitely see that a lot. There's got to be something a little bit more real. The God, the creator of the universe, who formed my people, the Jewish people, there's got to be something more for me to partake in than that. So I would say for sure. Um, in my own journey, I started to connect just because of what I was learning in school. I was taking Judaic studies classes in college and things like that. I started to meet on a regular basis with these three different rabbis, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, and a Reform rabbi. And as I was meeting with them, they were trying to teach me Hebrew. We were going over the Talmud, just all these different Jewish texts and all this different Jewish information being kind of thrown at me. And I was just interested. And somewhere along the line, I just felt this need to get to the bottom of, is God real? Because, like, I'm learning all of these things, and I want to know if I need to know about this or if I can just kind of go about doing my own thing. And so for me, I was just open to, is there any God at all? And I started looking into evidence for Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And I realized that you could funnel all of these three religions by one standard. Jesus is someone that all three of these religions take a stance on. If you figure out who Jesus is, you can figure out which of these three religions, Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, is most likely. And so as I started looking into this evidence and taking what I was learning back to my rabbis and showing, hey, this is what I'm finding out, and they'd challenge me and press me, I started to see that all the evidence is lining up that for sure Jesus was a real person, which I wasn't necessarily convinced of starting out. For sure, he was crucified. And then what shocked me is for sure, he rose from the dead. This is something that I was historically convinced of. And so for me, that was the moment where I decided, man, if the man who claimed the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures were about him, and claimed that he was the incarnation of the God of Israel, if he rose from the dead, which now I'm convinced happened, then I should probably trust him. Since then, I am equally convinced there's evidence for him through his work in my own life and in just the amazing complexity and communication of the Bible. But when I first came to faith, yeah, it was following this thread of evidence that he rose from the dead.
Can you talk about that a little bit? The evidence that he rose from the dead. There are a lot of skeptical people out there.
I think that the most convincing piece for me is that Christian and non-Christian scholars agree on an overwhelming amount of important facts. So they agree that Jesus was a real person, that Jesus was crucified and buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, that multiple individuals and groups of people had experiences of Jesus alive after his crucifixion. There's also Tacitus, a early Roman historian, Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian, and Pliny the Younger, a interrogator of Christians. They were not believers, but they also recorded evidence that confirms and corroborates important details within the four Gospels and within the letters. One final piece to share on that is the first book about Jesus' resurrection ever written by a Jewish person is written by an Orthodox rabbi named Pinchas Lapid. He wrote a book about the historical side of Jesus' resurrection, and he never accepted Jesus as the Messiah. He remained Orthodox his whole life. And he was convinced by the evidence that Jesus' resurrection was a real historical event. I think it goes a long way in saying if you really look at the evidence open-minded, Jesus rose from the dead. That happened, and we have to make sense of it.
That actually tees up perfectly to my next question because I was going to ask you, what do you think is the main sticking point, like for those three rabbis that you shared all this evidence with during your journey to faith, and beyond that, most Jews?
What is the main sticking point? I think there are a few different core reasons. I think it's different depending on who you're talking to. For the rabbis that I was talking to at that time, to them, it just was not so important. I don't really believe that God's going to judge me based on whether or not I get the Messiah right or wrong, because just Messiah is not an important piece of my mental framework.
I thought Messiah was very important in the Bible. Like there's so much talk about the Messiah.
Totally. In the Bible, he is the main point. He is the central message of the Hebrew Bible. Problem is, Judaism today is based more on the oral law, which is the lens that traditional Judaism reads the Hebrew Bible through. It's an interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. And it's an interpretation that has many different views on Messiah. It depends on, who you are, who your rabbi is. Are you ultra Orthodox? Are you conservative? But it also depends on which source you're prioritizing. If you're into Kabbalah, you'll most likely think that Messiah is very important, and you'll elevate what the Messiah is supposed to do. You say he needs to do all these miracles. He needs to rebuild the temple. But if you are in kind of the new growing movement to demystify Judaism and go back to the Talmud and specifically let the Mishnah and the Talmud rule your life,
Can you explain the Mishnah and the Talmud for those who don't know?
yeah, good idea. The Mishnah is a piece of Jewish literature post Jesus by a few hundred years that is a collection of Jewish rulings, legal decisions, and traditions that have been passed down. It's a law book of how to follow Judaism. The Talmud is a few hundred years later, and it takes a law from the Mishnah. And so you have the law, you have a parable about the law, like Jewish tradition story, and then you have a rabbi talking about what they think it means, and then you have a dissenting opinion of what that could mean, and then even on outside of that, you have commentary on the whole package. So there's a bunch of different voices trying to get at truth. It makes the Talmud a challenge to study and a challenge to pin down because you could take different sides.
It sounds very confusing.
Definitely, yeah.
I think you were saying that the rabbis base their views in prioritizing the Messiah more on the Talmud and Mishnah than they do the Old Testament.
Mishnah almost never talks about the Messiah and only in passing. And the Talmud really only has one full-size conversation about him. But that is important to think about in general because, like you noticed, Messiah is central in the Bible itself.
So you think that's the main sticking point when you came up to them and you said, I believe in Jesus now? I just think
For
it's
I
important because, as anyone listening to this is talking to a Jewish person about Christ, it's important to anticipate what they might say, like why they don't believe or why they're not open to believing.
That's really important. I totally agree. And I think they have different hangups. A really common one is that much of the Christian world, even though they're not necessarily representing Jesus accurately,
Right.
so-called Christianity has paved the way for so much of the real anti-Semitism in the world. There's so many people who may or may not have been Christian who have done things in the name of Jesus that are awful to the Jewish community. Now, if you're a Jewish person, you're not so focused on, is this really someone accurately representing Jesus? Because it's someone, holding a shield with a cross on it. This is the Jewish memory.
It's not as nuanced.
Yeah, why would you be? It's the community that's persecuting you. Why are you going to be so nuanced and forgiving? Like when you're being persecuted, you're not super interested in parsing out how faithful the persecutors are being to their ideals, you know? I was going to say there's an author who phrases it, I think, in a way that's really helpful. The same pages of history that Jewish people have seared into their memory are the same pages of history that Christians have torn out of their history books. There's a lot of truth to that. And as a Jewish person who's listening to Christians share about the love of Jesus with them, and then looking at these pages of history that they have memorized, these things that either Christians have done or have paved the way for, they go, I don't think that that could be the God of Israel if he would allow this to happen to our community. And I think dealing with that objection is going to be really helpful in dealing with or sharing with a lot of Jewish people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it made me think about my own story and growing
Mm.
up, how I was sort of trained to think that if you became a Christian or even open to believing in Jesus, how that's sort of the ultimate betrayal of your people. Because, I mean, growing up in the
Yeah.
aftermath of the Holocaust, I mean, they claimed to be Christian. And
Yeah.
so it's the enemy in a way. Um, so I just think it's when you're a Christian and you know real Christian love, just I pray that any Christian listening to this will want to and be able to share real Christian love with your Jewish neighbors and teach them what it's really about.
It goes so far when you're a Jewish person and you experience the real genuine love of Jesus from a Christian. It forces a paradigm shift. If you grew up, like sounds like you grew up and like I grew up, of Christians are kind of out to get us, or at most they're indifferent. When a Christian really shows you genuine love, it forces you to think about things differently and to ask questions.
So a lot of your work centers on the Torah. How did you go from finding Jesus to deciding that you want to share the Torah with both Gentiles and Jews?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Torah is something that Jews and Christians share in common. And it's the foundation of the biblical story. It's also considered the holiest text in Judaism. So, really, the goal of our ministry, the Torah Guide, is to help Jewish people discover the Messiah. And that Messiah is Jesus. And the way that the Torah functions in that is it sets the trajectory for a biblical story where humanity has severed its connection with its creator, and it's exiled itself from the Garden of Eden out into the world where pain and suffering, it's a consequence of being severed from its creator and its sustainer. So as we're out in this world, the human family moves from the Garden of Eden to Babylon in Genesis chapter 11. And then God's plan, starting in Genesis chapter 12, is to raise up a new descendant of Adam who's going to bring blessing where that consequence or curse is being experienced. And so it's the Jewish people, Abraham's family, who is the vehicle that is going to restore the human family that was introduced in the beginning. So as you follow the story, it is one giant promise for a redeemer, a certain Israelite who is going to restore Israel because they don't do much better than Adam. And that group of Israel, through that one Israelite, is going to restore all of humanity. So the goal of the Torah Guide is to show how the Torah is one promise for a Messiah and how that Messiah is good news for the Jewish people.
Something that I wrestle with personally is I want to honor my Jewish heritage in some ways, but Jesus replaced many of the old laws. And
Mhm.
so is it not Christian to still observe some of these ceremonial laws?
Mm. Is it not Christian to observe some of these ceremonial laws? You
That was a
know,
very convoluted question.
no, but it's a good question because I think that's something that most Jewish people who come to faith in Jesus are going to wrestle with. If not all Jewish people who come to faith in Jesus are going to wrestle with.
I think it would be good to talk about the different kinds of laws and
Yeah.
which ones of those, moral, civil, and ceremonial, are replaced by the new covenant
Mm.
and which still remain.
Mm. Yeah, so the law that God commanded the Jewish people starts in Exodus 19 and it goes through the end of the Torah. This is one law code. No law can be separated from the whole. It is a system. It is one covenant agreement that God made with the people. He said, if you indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be a kingdom of priests. So this is one covenant agreement. The problem is that we live in a time where that covenant is just no longer active. That was a system that revolved around temple worship, and it needed to be enforced. It needed a system of shoftim, or judges, chiefs, to be ruling over the people. It was a theocracy of Israel. And once you are no longer in the land, and once you no longer have the temple, you can't keep the covenant as a whole. So, as a corporate body of Jewish people, we are not keeping the law code given at Mount Sinai, the Sinai covenant. But the laws that are commanded inside the covenant as individuals are important and we can learn from them. So, we can't keep the covenant the way it was intended to be kept as a people, but we can learn from the laws in the covenant. And even though it's one system, they're never named moral, civil, or ceremonial laws as you're reading the Torah, but you can see that some laws are for the priests to keep, and some laws are about behavior and how to treat your neighbor and how to treat God. And then there's civil laws about how to govern the nation. Well, the second that Israel went into Babylonian captivity, the second that there's no longer a government of Israel, the civil laws become impossible to keep. The ceremonial laws are all doing something in common. They're all remembering past events, God's past faithfulness, and pointing forward to a future ultimate reality that God is going to bestow upon his people. So if we want to think about, man, how do we, as believers who believe that we are under a new covenant, how do we relate to this old covenant, the Sinai covenant? First, we have to remember that the Sinai covenant has not been active for a long time. By the time of Jesus, there was already many promises for a new covenant because the Sinai covenant was broken.
God's covenants are supposed to last forever. So, what's the explanation for why this covenant has been broken?
Absolutely right. This is a good tension point to bring up. So God's promise to Abraham was a covenant where this is going to happen. He made the covenant based on his own life. He had Abraham make a symbol of a covenant, splitting animals, setting them aside, and then based on his own word, he passed through the split animals. This is an ancient covenantal practice. Usually both covenant partners would pass through. And it would be a symbol of, if I don't keep my side of the covenant, let me be like these split animals. But God causes a deep sleep to fall on Abraham, and he's the one who passes through the split animals. So this is saying God is stamping it on his reputation, on his name, the covenant to Abraham, that he's going to use Abraham to be a blessing to all the nations. That is going to transpire. The covenant that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai is the natural progression of Abraham's covenant. God promised to use his descendants. And then in Exodus 19, we've already seen chapters of him forming this people into a people group. And at Exodus 19, he is now going to partner with the people group to be that blessing. And he says, if you indeed listen to my voice and keep my covenant, you will be to me a kingdom of priests. Immediately, immediately they break the promise. They do not listen to God's voice, they break the covenant. And then from that moment on, the rest of the Torah is God giving commands, then breaking commands. God giving commands, then breaking commands. That's the biblical story. Now, what happens that is super important to know is they were told, you will be a kingdom of priests if you keep the covenant. But the tragedy is they immediately broke the covenant and they became a kingdom who needed priests. So they were going to be a kingdom of priests and they become a kingdom with priests. So we're already getting the hint, even within the Torah's story, that the Jewish people, the people of Israel, have failed to meet their side of the Sinai covenant. But we already know there was a covenant promised first to Abraham that is not going to be broken. That covenant is everlasting. But the Sinai covenant, that had an if statement. If you do this, then this.
Interesting. I've never thought about the way those covenants were formed as so different. So you have the eternal one, and then you have the one that they broke.
Exactly. So how do you hold those things in tension? Well, if you keep reading the biblical story, covenants are going to become pillars in the story. So you have the Abraham covenant, then you have the Sinai covenant. And even though they don't keep up their side, I mean, you get to the end of Deuteronomy, and Moses looks at this people, and he says, I have set before you life and death. Choose life that you may live. Deuteronomy chapter 30. So this choice that they have to keep the covenant or to break the covenant is choosing between life and death. And as you read the rest of the biblical story, we find out that they received the curses, not the blessings. They did not keep the covenant. They were exiled. They landed in Babylon. So the question is, how is God going to maintain the covenant to Abraham when he was doing it through Israel, but they broke the covenant? They didn't live up to their side. Well, that's why you get the covenant to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. God makes a covenant with a certain Israelite that one of his descendants is going to be an eternal king. And all of these promises that have been made through the Torah get funneled through David's descendant. And later, Jeremiah 31 promises a new covenant. You have Jeremiah looking back at Israel's disobedience and saying God's going to make a new covenant. You have Ezekiel saying God's going to put a new heart into his people. That's how they'll be able to keep the law. And it's going to be his own spirit, God's own spirit. Isaiah adds something interesting in chapter 42. He's talking about one specific Israelite and says that he will be the covenant. So this is interesting. We have covenant to Abraham that is everlasting and going to happen. We have the Sinai covenant, a law code given to the Jewish people, and that is broken. And we have a promise for a new covenant, and that new covenant comes in the form of our Messiah, son of David.
Kind of bringing this all back to which groups of laws we as Christians are still supposed to follow. How do you take what we now know about the covenants and apply it here?
Great question. So, on the night before his crucifixion, Jesus takes this feast that points back to God's deliverance of the Jewish people to show that he was the one who is giving ultimate atonement to the Jewish people. So, I think we can look at that principle and say, when there are ceremonial laws, when there are laws that are meant to remember God's faithfulness and point forward to an ultimate reality, how can we take those principles, do the practices, and instead of making it about the practice, as if that is, checking off some box or giving us some spiritual step ahead, how can we let it point forward to Jesus? And I think that that's a good barometer to have, for sure.
When you were just talking about the Passover as, the night before Jesus was crucified, that's just incredible symbolism
Yeah,
and
it's
timing.
almost like it's divine. Maybe it was
Almost.
actually,
God's timing.
it was actually the same day if you think about it. Did you ever keep Shabbat growing up?
Oh yeah, how the days start at sundown.
Yeah, so if Jesus kept the Passover Seder and then the next morning was crucified, it was actually the same day on the Jewish calendar.
What does that mean to you? And have you thought about that before?
I think that just means that God was trying to show that Jesus is this Passover lamb. When John the Baptist looked and saw Jesus, he said, "Here is the Lamb of God." And, it does communicate so many things that the Hebrew Bible is always laying the foundation for. But the Passover became a really formative moment for the Jewish people. This is the symbol of God's deliverance. God freed us from bondage in slavery in Egypt. And Now, the Lamb of God is going to free us again, not from slavery to a nation, but slavery to a much darker reality, the spiritual evil that runs the world. He's saying, I'm going to deliver you from that into a kingdom of heaven.
Why do you think observing Passover through a Christian lens is not a more central part of Christianity? 'Cause it seems like it should be, like Maundy Thursday. Personally, we do a Passover Seder through a Christian lens, but I mean, everyone ought to, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think you're wrong at all. I think it has a lot to do with just the unfortunate history and just the fact that Gentile believers so outnumbered the Jewish believers. If Christianity had developed, if the church had developed in a way where it was honoring the biblical foundation of its faith set forward in the Torah and the prophets and that Jesus carried forward, I think it would be much more common for Jewish people to do more of the laws, to keep more of them, because that's what we see happening in Acts. People were still keeping the Torah. And Paul seems to approve of that. In Acts 21, Paul sacrifices in the temple to show that it's okay to keep the law. He says we're free from the law. And if you're free from the law, you're also free to keep the law.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, but it's true that the Torah has so much to teach us. And if we really were honoring it and living it and practicing it in a way to remember this ultimate reality that we've been invited into by accepting Jesus, it would teach us so much more.
Wrapping up for listeners who are curious to learn more about the Torah and the Jewish point of view on the Old Testament, what's a healthy next step that they can take, and where can they find your work?
I think one of the best things that any believer can do if they want to have a more solid foundation of how to understand the Old Testament, the way that Jesus would have read his Bible, is to follow the foundation. And the foundation of the Bible is set in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Spend more time than you think you should, really just getting saturated with the ideas and the themes that are being set in those chapters. And then spend a lot of time following those themes throughout the first 5 books. Promise you, it's going to unlock riches throughout the Hebrew Bible, and it's going to help you understand the New Testament more. If you want more resources, you can check out our podcast, the Torah Guide podcast. You can check out, we have some animated videos on YouTube. And also, my book would be a good next step. I have a book called Judaism, the Messiah, and Jewish Identity that kind of follows this same conversation even deeper.
Do you have any advice for people trying to read through the Bible for the first or 50th time, but seem to get hung up after the amazing story and action of Genesis and the beginning of
So like
Exodus?
halfway
Like
through
when they get to all
Exodus.
the laws, when they get to the
Yeah.
laws and oh, you're hearing about like the pus that comes from people's bodies and when you should and shouldn't stone people to death, like
You don't like
give them
reading
some
about the pus?
encouragement on getting, oh, gross. I'm reading through the Bible again, and I'm at the part where I just read about all the bodily functions. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah, no, it's probably more common than not to I want to read through the Bible and then I get halfway through Exodus, the laws start, and it's just like, why am I reading about ancient legal code here? And I don't want to pretend like I'm going to say anything and all of a sudden it's not going to be laws anymore. I think what has been helpful for me is to ask the question, what is this communicating in the story? Actually, one of your videos, I really liked the way that you said it. You said that when you're reading I think you said the Old Testament, maybe you said the Torah, it's like you're reading this rich family history. And that's exactly what it is. The Torah is the earliest record of the Jewish people according to early Jewish people. You are reading the story about how God is working through the Jewish people and why God is working through the Jewish people. So, as you're reading the Torah, look for why God is raising up this people. You keep reading and you start getting the laws. And then start looking for how does this set of laws that we're reading about now relate to the story that just happened? You're going to find things like, oh, Aaron's sons went into the tabernacle when they weren't supposed to, and now we're getting all of these laws about how priests should function. It's not random. There's this act of disobedience or this unfortunate situation, and then laws that relate to and can kind of provide commentary on that.
It's like parenting.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. And I think what you'll see is that Genealogies are going to be something that is like a conveyor belt that moves the story forward, and laws are going to be like parenting, where they're going to be commenting on things that happened and providing instruction and principles for how to move forward. It's not going to make you be reading something that is no longer laws, but I think it maybe can hold your interest longer if you view it that way.
I like to end each episode with a Bible verse. Is there one that you would like to share that you think might shed a little extra light on our conversation, or one that's inspired you along your unconventional religious journey?
Wow, that's a big question. You know,
Or just your favorite one?
sure. I think my mind always goes to Joshua 1, 7 and 8. Here, let me read it so I don't misquote it. I think this also kind of speaks to what we were saying. Okay, so Joshua 1, 7 through 8. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. What more can you say than that? This book of the Torah, this book of instruction, if you meditate on it, if you live your life by it, it will reframe your definition of prosperity. It'll reframe your definition of success, and you'll have what you need.
I love that. So what's next for you? You think you'll ever move on to the prophets or the proverbs, or you staying in Torah? I guess there's a lot to do with the Torah.
Yeah, there is a lot to do with the Torah. It's a holistic endeavor. We're trying to get at what the whole counsel of the word teaches. The Torah is the foundation, though, so it's a good starting point. But absolutely, we've carried into the New Testament a bit, so we'll do a thorough study.
I love that. Well, Aaron Dranoff, host of the Torah Guide podcast, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been a really illuminating conversation from a unique perspective for a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a great combo.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in. If today's conversation encouraged you, please rate Fulfilled 5 stars and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Stay inspired, keep trusting in God's plan for your life, and we'll see you next time.